It was a bright, sunny afternoon in Meadow Lane. The sky was big and blue, with fluffy white clouds floating like cotton candy. Birds chirped in the trees, and a soft wind rustled the leaves. Meadow Lane was a quiet little street with neat houses, green lawns, and happy people walking their dogs or riding bikes. Everyone seemed to like it here well, almost everyone. Tim Carter was the new guy in town. He rolled into Meadow Lane about a month ago, driving a beat-up old truck filled with boxes. His hair was messy, his jeans were faded, and he had a big, friendly smile. When he pulled up to his new house, a small, cozy place with a tiny porch, he hopped out and started unloading. Boxes of clothes, a lamp with a goofy shade, and even a big red toolbox clunked onto the grass. Neighbors peeked out their windows or waved as they passed by. "Hey, welcome," one guy shouted from across the street. Tim waved back, all polite and cheerful. "Thanks," he called, wiping sweat off his forehead. Most people liked Tim right away. He seemed normal, just a regular guy trying to settle in. Mrs. Jenkins, the sweet old lady next door, brought him a plate of cookies the very first day. "You look like a nice young man," she said, her eyes crinkling with a smile. Tim thanked her and munched on a cookie while he carried more stuff inside. Kids on bikes zipped by, yelling hellos, and even the mailman gave him a nod. Yep, Tim Carter fit right in, or so everyone thought. But not everyone was happy about the new guy. Oh no, there was one person who didn't smile, didn't wave, and definitely didn't bring cookies. Her name was Karen Phelps, and she was trouble with a capital T. Karen lived 3 houses down from Tim, in a big white house with perfect flowers and a shiny mailbox. She wasn't just any neighbor, though. Karen was the boss of the HOA. That's the Homeowners Association, in case you don't know. It's a group that makes rules for the neighborhood, like how tall your grass can grow or what color your house can be. And Karen? She loved those rules more than anything. She loved them so much, she acted like she owned the whole street. Karen was tall and skinny, with sharp eyes that could spot a weed from a mile away. Her hair was always pulled back tight, and she wore bright red lipstick that made her look like she was ready to yell at someone. She carried a little notebook everywhere, scribbling down notes about people's yards or mailboxes. If your trash can was out too long, Karen knew. If your dog barked too loud, Karen heard. And if you broke even one tiny rule, watch out, because Karen Phelps was coming for you. The second Tim moved in, Karen's radar went off. She stood on her porch that first day, arms crossed, staring at him like he was a bug she wanted to squish. "Who's this guy?" she muttered to herself, tapping her pen on her notebook. She didn't like new people. New people meant new problems, and Karen didn't have time for problems unless she was the one causing them. Tim didn't know it yet, but Karen had her eagle eyes locked on him from the very start. Those eyes were sharp, sneaky, and ready to pounce. Now, let's talk about that first week. Tim was busy unpacking. He hauled boxes inside, set up a little table in the kitchen, and even hung a goofy picture of a dog wearing sunglasses on his wall. It was the kind of stuff you'd expect from a regular guy, right? He'd step outside sometimes, stretching his arms and breathing in the fresh air. The sun shone down, the birds sang, and Meadow Lane felt like a happy place. Neighbors kept being nice, too. Mr. Lopez from down the street stopped by with a lawnmower tip. "Cut the grass every Saturday," he said with a wink. "Keeps it neat." Tim nodded and thanked him, still smiling that easy smile. But Karen? She wasn't smiling. Nope, not even a little. Every time Tim stepped outside, she was watching. She'd peek through her curtains or stand on her porch, pretending to water her flowers. Those flowers didn't need water, they were already perfect, but Karen needed an excuse to spy. She'd squint at Tim, her lips pressed tight, like she was waiting for him to mess up. And in her head, she was already making a list. "Too many boxes on the lawn," she grumbled one day. "That truck's too loud," she huffed the next. Karen was sure Tim was trouble. She just didn't know how yet. Here's the funny part, though, Tim didn't seem to care. He'd catch Karen staring sometimes, and what did he do? He waved. Yep, he'd lift his hand, flash that big grin, and say, "Hey, Karen. Nice day, huh?" Most people would have been annoyed by her glares, but not Tim. He acted like she was just another friendly face. Karen didn't wave back, of course. She'd huff, turn away, and stomp inside, her notebook clutched tight. "He's up to something," she'd mutter. "I'll figure it out. Now, let's slow down a bit and paint the picture." Meadow Lane wasn't a huge place, just a few dozen houses lined up nice and neat. The street curved a little, like a smile, and there was a park at the end with swings and a slide. Kids played there after school, their laughter bouncing through the air. Dogs barked, chasing balls or sniffing bushes. It was the kind of neighborhood where people left their doors unlocked and shared lemonade on hot days. Everyone got along well, almost everyone. Karen didn't get along with anybody unless they followed her rules. Tim's house sat right in the middle of the street. It wasn't fancy like Karen's, but it was cute. The paint was a soft blue, the porch had a rocking chair, and the yard was small but green. He didn't have much stuff yet, just that truck, some boxes, and a rusty old bike leaning against the garage. He looked like a guy starting fresh, maybe after a big move or a new job. That's what people guessed, anyway. "Wonder where he's from," Mrs. Jenkins said one day, sipping tea on her porch. "Seems nice enough," Mr. Lopez agreed, trimming his hedge. Nobody thought too hard about it. Tim was just Tim, new, normal, and friendly. But here's the thing nobody knew: Tim wasn't just a regular guy. Nope, not even close. Under that messy hair and behind that big smile, he was hiding something. Something huge. Something so wild, it would turn Meadow Lane upside down and make Karen wish she'd never crossed him. What was it? Oh, you're gonna love this, but I'm not telling you yet. You've got to stick with me, because this story's just getting started. Let's rewind a bit and talk about that sunny afternoon, the one where this whole mess really kicked off. It was a Saturday, and Tim was outside again. The sun was high, the air was warm, and he was whistling a little tune. He'd finished unpacking most of his boxes, and now he was poking around his yard. See, Tim's house came with a backyard, a small one, fenced in with some old, wobbly wood. The fence was falling apart, with gaps big enough for a cat to slip through. Tim scratched his head, looking at it. "Gotta fix this," he said to himself. "Need some privacy around here." So, what did he do? He grabbed his toolbox, hopped in his truck, and drove off. An hour later, he was back with a pile of wood planks stacked in the truck bed. They were tall and sturdy, perfect for a new fence. Tim got to work right away. He pulled on some gloves, grabbed a hammer, and started yanking out the old boards. Bang, bang, bang. The noise echoed down the street. Kids on bikes slowed down to watch, and Mrs. Jenkins peeked over with a grin. "Building something nice," she called. "Yep." Tim shouted back, wiping his brow. "Just a little fence." It was all normal stuff, right? A guy fixing up his yard. No big deal. Except to Karen. Oh boy, to Karen, this was a huge deal. She was out on her porch again, watering those perfect flowers, when she heard the banging. Her head snapped up like a dog hearing a whistle. She squinted down the street, and when she saw Tim hammering away, her eyes went wide. "A fence," she whispered, like it was some evil plan. She dropped her watering can splash, and marched closer, her notebook already open. Tim didn't see her at first. He was too busy pulling nails and stacking wood. The sun beat down, his shirt got sweaty, and he kept whistling that happy tune. But Karen? She was steaming. She stopped a few feet away, hands on her hips, staring at that pile of wood like it was a monster. "What's he doing?" she muttered. "That's too tall. Way too tall. HOA rules say 2 feet max. 2 feet. She flipped open her notebook, scribbling fast. New guy. Fence. Breaking rules. Day 1. Tim finally noticed her. He looked up, mid-hammer, and there she was, Karen Phelps, glaring like a hawk. Most people would have flinched or asked what was wrong. Not Tim. He just paused, wiped his hands on his jeans, and grinned. "Hey, Karen," he said, all bright and cheery. "Like the new fence?" Karen's face went red. She didn't answer. She just pointed at the wood and snapped, "That's too tall. HOA rules. Take it down." Then she spun around and stormed off, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk. Tim watched her go, still smiling. He didn't yell back. He didn't argue. He just shrugged, picked up his hammer, and kept working. Bang, bang, Bang. The fence started taking shape, board by board. It was taller than the old one, sure maybe 3 feet high instead of 2. But it looked nice, strong, and neat. Mrs. Jenkins clapped from her porch. "Looks good, Tim," she called. He waved back, laughing. "Thanks. Gotta keep the rabbits out." Karen didn't think it was funny. Nope, not one bit. She was already plotting, already thinking of ways to stop him. She didn't know it yet, but that fence was just the beginning. Tim wasn't just building a fence to keep rabbits out. He was building something else, something that would catch her off guard and shake up everything she thought she controlled. So, what was Tim hiding? Why wasn't he scared of Karen's glares or her rules? And why did he keep smiling, even when she stomped away? I'll give you a tiny hint, Tim wasn't who he seemed. He had a secret, a big one, tucked away like a treasure chest waiting to be opened. And when that chest popped open, oh man, Meadow Lane would never be the same. But don't worry, I'm not spilling it yet. You've got to keep reading, keep guessing, because this story's got twists and turns you won't believe. That sunny afternoon? It was the start of something wild. Tim Carter wasn't just a regular guy, and Karen Phelps was about to find out the hard way. Stick with me, because we're just warming up. Picture this, it's a sunny afternoon in Meadow Lane. The sun is shining bright, like a big yellow ball in the sky. The air smells like fresh grass and flowers, and little birds are singing their happy songs. Meadow Lane is a small street with cute houses all in a row. Some are white, some are blue, and they all have neat little yards. Kids ride bikes up and down, laughing and yelling. Dogs wag their tails, chasing sticks or sniffing bushes. It's a friendly place where people wave and say hi, well, most people, anyway. Into this happy little world comes Tim Carter. Tim is the new guy. He moved in about a month ago, rolling up in an old truck that rumbled and coughed like it was tired. The truck was full of stuff, big brown boxes, a bumpy old chair, and a toolbox that clinked when he moved it. Tim jumped out, stretched his arms, and looked around. He had messy brown hair, a big smile, and jeans with holes in the knees. He looked like a regular guy, someone you'd see at the store buying milk or walking a dog. Nothing fancy, nothing weird, just him. When he got to his new house, he started unloading. His house was small and cozy, with a tiny porch and a red door. He carried boxes inside, one by one, huffing and puffing a little. Neighbors peeked out to see who this new person was. "Hi there," called Mr. Brown from across the street. He was watering his garden and waved with a wet hand. Tim waved back. "Hey, thanks," he said, grinning. Mrs. Lee, who lived next door, poked her head out. She had gray hair and a kind face. "Welcome to Meadow Lane," she shouted, holding a plate of cookies. Tim jogged over, took a cookie, and said, "Wow, these are great." He seemed nice. Everyone thought so. The kids on bikes slowed down to stare. "Who's that guy?" one whispered. "Dunno, but he's got a cool truck," another said. Even the dog seemed to like him. One little pup ran up and licked his hand. Tim laughed and scratched its ears. Yep, Tim Carter was fitting right in. He waved at people walking by, said hello to the mailman, and even helped a kid pick up a ball that rolled away. To everyone watching, he was just a regular guy moving into a regular house on a regular street. But here's the thing, they didn't know the whole story. Not yet. See, not everyone was happy about Tim showing up. Most people smiled and waved, but one person didn't. Her name was Karen Phelps, and she was different. Karen lived a few houses down from Tim, in a big white house with a perfect lawn. Her flowers were so neat, they looked fake. Her mailbox was shiny, like she polished it every day. Karen wasn't just any neighbor, she was the boss of the HOA. That's the Homeowners Association. It's a group that makes rules for the neighborhood, like how short your grass has to be or what color your curtains can be. And Karen? She loved those rules. She loved them so much, she acted like she was the queen of Meadow Lane. Karen was tall and thin, with sharp eyes that could spot trouble from far away. Her hair was always tied back tight, and she wore bright red lipstick that made her look mad even when she wasn't. She carried a little notebook everywhere, scribbling stuff down with a pen. If your trash can stayed out too long, Karen wrote it down. If your dog barked once, Karen heard it. If you painted your fence the wrong shade of blue, Karen was at your door with a frown. She was the rule keeper, the boss, the one who made sure everyone followed her orders. The day Tim moved in, Karen was watching. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, staring at him like he was a puzzle she didn't like. His truck rolled up, and she squinted. "New guy," she muttered, tapping her pen on her notebook. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just watched. Tim didn't notice at first, he was too busy hauling boxes and saying hi to people. But Karen's eyes followed him like a hawk tracking a mouse. She didn't trust new people. New people could mess things up, break rules, or cause trouble. And Karen hated trouble unless she was the one starting it. Let's talk about that first day some more. Tim was busy. He carried a big box inside, then came back for a lamp with a funny shade shaped like a pineapple. He hauled in a chair, a bag of clothes, and that clinky toolbox. The sun was hot, and he wiped sweat off his face with his shirt. Neighbors kept being nice. Mrs. Lee with the cookies said, "You need any help?" Tim shook his head. "Nah, I got it, but thanks," he said. Mr. Brown shouted, "Hope you like it here." Tim nodded. "It's a cool place," he called back. Everything seemed normal, happy, and easy. But Karen? She wasn't happy. Not one bit. She stayed on her porch, watching every move Tim made. When he dropped a box and some socks fell out, she wrote it down. "Messy," she grumbled. When his truck backfired with a loud pop, she scribbled again. "Noisy," she huffed. She didn't like his messy hair or his old jeans or the way he smiled too much. To Karen, Tim was already a problem. She didn't know why yet, but she was sure of it. "I'll keep an eye on him," she told herself, nodding like it was a big plan. The funny thing was, Tim didn't seem to care. Most people would feel weird with someone staring at them all day. Not Tim. Sometimes he'd look up, see Karen glaring, and what did he do? He waved. "Hey, Karen," he'd say, all cheery and bright. "Nice flowers you got there." Karen never waved back. She'd just frown, turn away, and march inside her house, slamming the door. "He's too friendly," she muttered. "Nobody's that nice. He's hiding something." She didn't know what, but she was going to find out. Let's paint the scene a little more. Meadow Lane was a pretty street. The houses sat close together, with little fences or bushes between them. The road curved like a snake, and at the end was a park with swings and a slide. Kids loved that park. They'd run there after school, shouting and playing tag. Dogs barked, chasing each other around. The air smelled like barbecue on weekends, and sometimes you'd hear music from someone's radio. It was a happy place, a safe place, where people knew each other and got along. Well, except for Karen. She didn't get along with anyone unless they did exactly what she said. Tim's house was right in the middle of the street. It wasn't big like Karen's, just a little place with blue walls and a red door. The porch had a rocking chair that creaked when you sat in it. The yard was small, with grass that needed a trim. Tim didn't have much stuff, just his truck, some boxes, and that toolbox. He looked like a guy starting over, maybe after moving from far away. That's what people thought, anyway. "Wonder what his story is," Mrs. Lee said one day, sipping tea on her porch. "Seems like a good kid," Mr. Brown agreed, watering his plants. Nobody asked too many questions. Tim was just the new guy, and that was fine. But here's the big secret nobody knew: Tim wasn't just a regular guy. Nope, not at all. Behind that big smile and those holy jeans, he was hiding something. Something huge. Something so wild, it would flip Meadow Lane upside down and make Karen wish she'd never stared at him. What was it? Oh, I'm not telling you yet. You've got to stick with me, because this is just the beginning. Let's zoom in on that sunny afternoon when things started to get interesting. It was a Saturday, and Tim was outside again. The sun was high, the sky was blue, and he was humming a little song. He'd unpacked most of his boxes by now. His house looked lived in, with that pineapple lamp glowing in the window. Today, he was checking out his backyard. It was a small space behind the house, with an old fence that wobbled in the wind. The fence was falling apart, boards were loose, nails stuck out, and there were holes big enough for a squirrel to sneak through. Tim stood there, hands on his hips, looking at it. This won't do, he said to himself. I need a better fence. So, what did he do? He grabbed his toolbox, hopped in his truck, and drove off. The truck rumbled down the street, puffing little clouds of smoke. Kids waved as he passed, and he waved back. An hour later, he was back with a big stack of wood in the truck bed. The wood was tall and strong, perfect for a new fence. Tim jumped out, pulled on some gloves, and got to work. He grabbed a hammer and started pulling out the old boards. Bang! 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 The noise bounced down the street. Kids stopped their bikes to watch. Mrs. Lee peeked over. Fixing the fence, she called. Yep. Tim said, grinning. Gonna make it nice. It was all normal, right? Just a guy building a fence. No big deal. Except to Karen. To Karen, this was a huge deal. She was on her porch again, pretending to water her flowers, when she heard the banging. Her head popped up fast. She squinted down the street, and when she saw Tim hammering away, her mouth dropped open. A fence, she whispered, like it was the worst thing ever. She dropped her watering can, water splashed everywhere, and started walking closer, her notebook in her hand. Tim didn't see her yet. He was busy yanking nails and stacking wood. The sun was hot, his shirt was sweaty, and he kept humming that little song. But Karen was coming. She stopped a few feet away, staring at the wood like it was a monster. That's too tall, she muttered. Way too tall. HOA rules say 2 feet. 2 feet only. She flipped open her notebook and started writing fast. New guy. Fence. Too big. Rule breaker. Her pen scratched loud, like she was mad at the paper. Then Tim looked up. He was holding a hammer, and there was Karen, glaring at him. Most people would have stopped or asked what was wrong. Not Tim. He just smiled that big, easy smile and said, Hey, Karen. What do you think of the fence? Karen's face turned red. She pointed at the wood and yelled, That's too tall. HOA rules. Take it down. Then she turned and stomped off, her notebook flapping in her hand. Tim watched her go. He didn't yell back. He didn't get mad. He just shrugged, picked up his hammer, and kept going. Bang. 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 The fence started to look good, taller than the old one, maybe 3 feet high. Mrs. Lee clapped. Nice job, Tim, she said. He waved back. Thanks. Gotta keep the critters out, he laughed. Karen didn't laugh. She was already planning her next move. She didn't know it, but that fence was just the start. Tim wasn't just building a fence, he was building something bigger. Something that would catch her by surprise and shake up everything. What was it? Hang on tight, we're getting there. Alright, let's jump into this next part of the story. I'm going to write the rising action and small revelations section, stretching it out to at least 5,000 words with super simple, easy English that a 4th or 6th grader can understand. I'll keep it exciting, sneaky, and full of little clues to make you wonder what's coming next. Here we go. Rising action and small revelations. Days went by after Tim built his fence, and things in Meadow Lane got a little wild. The sun kept shining, the birds kept singing, and kids still rode their bikes up and down the street. Tim's new fence stood tall in his backyard, 3 feet high, strong, and neat. Most people liked it. Mrs. Lee, the nice lady next door, said, It looks so good, Tim. Mr. Brown from across the street nodded. Keeps the rabbits out, huh, he said with a grin. Everyone seemed fine with it, everyone except Karen Phelps. Karen was the boss of the HOA, and she hated that fence. Hated it with all her heart. She couldn't stop thinking about it. Every day, she'd find a reason to walk by Tim's house. Sometimes she'd pretend to check her mailbox. Other times, she'd act like she was looking at the sky. But really, she was staring at that fence. Her sharp eyes squinted, and her lips got all tight, like she'd eaten a sour lemon. She'd pull out her phone, snap pictures of the fence from every angle, and mutter to herself. Too tall, she'd grumble. 3 feet? Rules say 2 feet. This is a violation. She'd shake her head and stomp her foot, like the fence was laughing at her. Karen didn't just stop at pictures. Nope, she got bossy. One morning, she marched right up to Tim's front door. The sun was barely up, and the grass was still wet with dew. Tim was inside, sipping coffee, when he heard a loud knock. Bang! 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 He opened the door, and there was Karen, holding her notebook like a weapon. "That fence is wrong," she barked, pointing toward the backyard. "HOA rules say 2 feet max. Take it down, or you're in big trouble." Her voice was loud, and her red lipstick looked even redder when she was mad. Tim didn't yell back. He didn't even frown. He just stood there in his pajamas, holding his coffee mug, and smiled. "Good morning, Karen," he said, calm as can be. "I'll look at the rules, okay?" Karen blinked, surprised. She wanted a fight, but Tim wasn't giving her one. "You better," she snapped, then turned and stormed off, her shoes clicking on the sidewalk. Tim watched her go, still smiling, and shut the door. Weird, right? Most people would have gotten mad or told her to go away. But not Tim. He was cool as a cucumber. The next day, Karen was back. This time, she didn't knock. She just stood in Tim's front yard, taking more pictures. Click. 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 Her phone flashed as she zoomed in on the fence. She muttered louder this time. "This is a violation. A big one. He's breaking my rules." Then she pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She scribbled fast, her hand shaking a little. When she was done, she marched up to Tim's door and stuck the note right on it with a piece of tape. The note said, "Take it down or else," in big, angry letters. Then she walked away, her head held high like she'd won a prize. Tim found the note later that day. He was coming back from the store, carrying a bag of apples, when he saw it. He peeled it off the door, read it, and chuckled. "Yep," he laughed. "Or else," he said to himself, shaking his head. Then he waved at Mrs. Lee, who was watering her flowers. "Good morning," he called, all cheery. Mrs. Lee waved back. "Morning, Tim. Everything okay?" she asked. "Oh, sure," he said, holding up the note. "Just Karen being Karen." He crumpled the paper, tossed it in the trash, and went inside. No yelling, no arguing, just a wave and a smile. Super weird, huh? Days turned into more days, and Karen kept going. She was like a dog with a bone, she wouldn't let that fence go. One afternoon, she stood by Tim's house with a measuring tape. Yep, a real measuring tape. She stretched it out, squinting at the fence. 3 feet, she hissed. "I knew it. 3 whole feet." She wrote it down in her notebook, underlining it twice. Then she took more pictures. Click, click, click. A kid on a bike rode by and stared. "What's she doing?" he whispered to his friend. "Dunno," the friend said. "She's weird." Karen didn't care. She was on a mission. Another time, she left a second note. This one said, "You're in trouble now. Take it down." Tim found it stuck to his mailbox that evening. He was watering his grass, humming a little song, when he spotted it. He pulled it off, read it, and laughed again. "Trouble, huh," he said, tucking it in his pocket. Then he waved at Mr. Brown, who was walking his dog. "Hey, Mr. B." Tim called. "Hey, Tim." Mr. Brown said back. "What's with the note?" Tim shrugged. "Oh, just Karen stuff," he said, grinning. He didn't seem worried at all. Most people would have been mad by now, yelling or complaining. But Tim? He just kept being nice. It was almost spooky how calm he was. Karen didn't stop. She kept coming by, sometimes in the morning, sometimes at night. She'd glare at the fence, snap pictures, and leave notes. One note said, "This is your last warning." Another said, "I'm calling someone." Tim found them all, read them all, and tossed them all. He'd wave at her when he saw her, say good morning or nice day, huh, and go about his business. Karen hated it. She wanted him to fight back, to get mad, to take the fence down. But Tim wouldn't budge. He acted like nothing was wrong. It drove her crazy. Now, here's where it gets really good. Karen thought she was the only one watching. She thought she was the smart one, the sneaky one, catching Tim breaking her rules. But guess what? Tim was watching her too. Yep, he had his own little game going on, and Karen didn't even know it. Every time she came by, stomping and muttering, Tim saw her. He'd peek out his window or glance over while he worked in the yard. And when she left, he did something strange. See, after Karen would storm off, her shoes clicking and her notebook flapping, Tim would pull out his phone. It was just a regular phone, nothing fancy, but he'd tap on it real quick. His fingers moved fast, like he was writing something. Then he'd tuck it back in his pocket and keep going, watering the grass, fixing his porch, or just sitting with a soda. What was he writing? Was it a text to a friend? A grocery list: milk, bread, apples. Maybe a note about Karen, like she's mad again? Nope. It was none of those things. It was something way bigger, something way sneakier. Something that would make Karen wish she'd never messed with him or his fence. Let's slow down and look at one of those times. It was a sunny Tuesday, and Karen showed up again. She had her phone out, snapping pictures like always. Click. Click. The fence stood there, tall and quiet, while she circled it like a shark. Still too tall, she muttered. He thinks he's so smart. She scribbled in her notebook, then stuck another note on Tim's door. This one said, "You can't ignore me." She taped it up hard, like she was punching the door, then marched away. Her face was red, and she was breathing fast. Tim was inside, eating a sandwich, when he heard her stomp off. He got up, peeked out the window, and watched her go. She turned the corner, and he grinned, just a little grin, like he knew something she didn't. Then he pulled out his phone. Tap, tap, tap. His fingers flew over the screen. He wrote something, nodded to himself, and put the phone away. Then he went back to his sandwich, taking a big bite like nothing happened. What was he writing? It wasn't a game, it wasn't a joke, it was something big, something secret. But Karen had no clue. Another time, it was evening. The sun was going down, painting the sky orange and pink. Karen crept by, thinking she was sneaky. She had a flashlight, shining it on the fence. Still there, she huffed. Still wrong. She took more pictures, click, click, and left a note, "This ends soon." Tim was on his porch, rocking in his chair, when she stuck it on the door. He saw her, waved, and said, "Night, Karen." She ignored him and hurried off, her flashlight bobbing in the dark. As soon as she was gone, Tim pulled out his phone again. Tap, tap, tap. He wrote something fast. His face stayed calm, but his eyes were sharp, like he was thinking hard. He finished, slipped the phone in his pocket, and rocked in his chair, sipping a lemonade. The stars came out, the crickets chirped, and Meadow Lane got quiet. But Tim's secret? It was growing, getting bigger every time Karen came by. And she didn't even know she was helping him. Days kept passing, and Karen kept pushing. She'd show up with her pictures, her notes, her measuring tape. 3 feet, she'd say, shaking her head. He's breaking the rules. She'd leave messages like, "Fix this now, or I'm done warning you." Tim never got mad. He'd find the notes, smile, and throw them away. He'd wave at her, say hi, and keep doing his thing, mowing the lawn, painting his mailbox, or just sitting outside. It was like he didn't care. But he did care. He cared a lot, just not about the fence. See, Tim wasn't scared of Karen. He wasn't worried about her notes or her rules. Why? Because he had a plan. Every time she came by, every time she got mad, he wrote it down on his phone. Tap, tap, tap. What was it? Was he counting her visits? Was he making fun of her? Nope. It was something way cooler, way smarter. Something that was going to turn everything upside down and make Karen wish she'd left that fence alone. Let's picture one more day. It was a Saturday, and the street was busy. Kids played in the park, dogs barked, and someone was grilling hamburgers. Karen showed up at Tim's house again. She had her phone, her notebook, and a big frown. She stood in his yard, taking pictures, click, click, click. "This fence is illegal," she said loud enough for Mrs. Lee to hear. Mrs. Lee peeked over. "It's a nice fence, Karen," she said. Karen glared at her. "It's 3 feet," she shouted. "Rules say 2. She wrote in her notebook, then slapped a note on Tim's door, "You're finished." Tim came out right then, holding a rake. He'd been cleaning his yard. "Hey, Karen," he said, waving. "Beautiful day, right?" Karen didn't answer. She turned and stomped off, muttering about rules and trouble. Tim watched her go, then pulled out his phone. Tap, 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 he wrote something quick. He smiled a small, sneaky smile and put the phone away. Then he went back to raking, whistling like nothing was wrong. But something was wrong for Karen. She didn't know it, but Tim wasn't just a guy with a fence. He was watching her, writing stuff down, building up to something huge. Every note she left, every picture she took, every time she yelled, it was all part of his plan. What was he planning? "Oh, it's so good, you're gonna flip when you find out." But not yet. We're still in the middle, and the best part's coming soon. Karen thought she was in charge. She thought she could boss Tim around, make him take the fence down, scare him with her notes. But Tim wasn't scared. He was ready. Ready for what? Stick with me, because this story's about to get wild. One morning, everything changed in Meadow Lane. The sun was up, shining bright, and the air smelled like fresh grass. Kids were already out, riding bikes and yelling, while dogs barked at squirrels. It was a normal day until Karen Phelps decided she'd had enough. She was done with Tim's fence. Done with his smiles. Done with him ignoring her notes. She was going to win this fight, and she had a big plan. Karen woke up early that day. Her house was quiet, her perfect flowers still wet with dew. She put on her favorite red lipstick, grabbed her phone, and stood by her window, staring down the street at Tim's house. That fence 3 feet tall, strong, and proud stared back at her. "Too tall," she muttered, her eyes narrow. "He thinks he's smarter than me. Not today." She'd been snapping pictures, leaving notes, and measuring that fence for days, but Tim wouldn't take it down. Now, she was ready to bring out the big guns. She tapped her phone, her fingers shaking a little. She dialed 3 numbers, 9-1-1. Yep, she was calling the police. Her voice was loud and squeaky when the operator answered. "Hello? Yes, this is Karen Phelps from Meadow Lane. There's an illegal structure at 14 Meadow Lane. It's a fence 3 feet tall. HOA rules say 2 feet max. I need an officer here now." She practically screamed into the phone, pacing her porch. The operator said, "Okay, ma'am, we'll send someone." Karen hung up, a big smirk spreading across her face. "Got him now," she said to herself, crossing her arms. She didn't wait inside. Nope, Karen wanted to see this happen. She marched down the street, her shoes clicking fast on the sidewalk. She stopped right in Tim's front yard, standing tall with her phone in her hand. That fence loomed behind the house, mocking her. She glared at it, then at Tim's red door. "You're done, new guy," she whispered, her smirk growing bigger. She could already picture it, a police car rolling up, an officer agreeing with her, Tim tearing down the fence with a sad face. She'd win. She'd be the boss again. Oh, she couldn't wait. Tim was inside, eating breakfast. He had a bowl of cereal, crunchy flakes with cold milk, and was sitting at his little table. The sun came through the window, lighting up his cozy kitchen. He didn't know Karen was outside, plotting. He didn't hear her call 911. He was just munching away, humming a little tune, calm as ever. That's when it happened. Sirens. Faint at first, then louder. Wee-oh-oh, wee-oh-oh. Tim looked up, spoon halfway to his mouth. "Huh," he said, tilting his head. He wasn't scared, just curious. Karen heard the sirens too. Her heart jumped. "Yes," she said, clapping her hands. She turned toward the street, watching, waiting. The sound got closer, wee-oh-oh, and then, there it was. A police car rolled around the corner, lights flashing red and blue. It moved slow, tires crunching on the road, heading right for Tim's house. Karen's smirk turned into a huge grin. "Here we go," she said, bouncing a little. She stood in the yard, hands on her hips, ready to point at the fence and tell the cop everything. The car stopped right in front of Tim's house. The lights kept flashing, and a big officer stepped out. He was tall, with a blue uniform and a shiny badge. He adjusted his hat and looked around. Karen waved her arms like she was flagging down a plane. "Over here," she shouted. "It's the fence. 3 feet tall. Illegal." She pointed at the backyard, hopping a little, so excited she could burst. This was it, her big moment. She'd show Tim who was in charge. But the cop didn't look at her. Nope, he didn't even turn his head. He walked right past Karen, his boots thumping on the grass, and headed for Tim's door. Karen blinked. "Hey," she said, confused. "It's the fence. Over there." The cop ignored her. He knocked on the door, knock, 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 steady and loud. Karen's smirk started to fade. What was going on? Why wasn't he listening to her? Inside, Tim put down his cereal. He stood up, stretched, and walked to the door. He opened it, and there was the cop, standing tall. "Tim Carter," the cop asked, tipping his hat a little. Tim nodded, cool as a cucumber. "Hey, Mike," he said, smiling. "Good to see you." The cop Mike smiled back. "You too, Tim," he said. They shook hands, easy and friendly, like old buddies catching up. Karen's jaw dropped. "Wait, what?" Tim knew the cop. Her eyes went wide, and her phone slipped a little in her hand. She stood there, frozen, watching them chat. "Nice day, huh?" Tim said. "Yep," Mike the cop said. "How's the job going?" Karen's brain spun. Job? What job? Why were they talking like this? She'd called the police to get Tim in trouble, not to have a friendly visit. "Hey," she shouted, stepping closer. "What about the fence? It's illegal." Mike glanced at her, then back at Tim. He didn't say anything to her, just kept talking to Tim. Karen's face turned red. She stomped her foot. "I called you," she yelled. "That fence is 3 feet tall. Rules say to do something." But before Mike could answer, something else happened. Another car pulled up. This one had lights too flashing bright, but it wasn't a regular police car. It was plain, dark, and serious looking. A man stepped out, and he wasn't wearing a uniform. He had a suit, shiny shoes, and a badge on his belt. He looked sharp, like someone important. Karen stared. "Who's that?" she muttered. The new guy walked over, his face hard and focused. He didn't look at the fence. He didn't look at Tim. He looked right at Karen. "Karen Phelps," he said, his voice sharp like a knife. Karen blinked. Yeah," she said, her smirk gone now. The man pulled out his badge and held it up. It glinted in the sun. "Detective Harris," he said. "You're under arrest for fraud and embezzlement." Karen's mouth fell open so wide, you could have tossed a ball in it. What?" she stammered, her voice squeaky. "Arrest? Fraud? What are you talking about?" Her hands shook, and her phone dropped to the grass plop. Detective Harris stepped closer. "We've been watching you," he said. "You've been stealing money from the HOA. Thousands of dollars. It's over, Karen." He pulled out handcuffs, shiny and cold, and dangled them in front of her. Karen's eyes darted around. "No. This is a mistake," she yelled. "I didn't steal anything. I'm the boss here." She pointed at Tim. "He's the problem. His fence is illegal. I called 911 about him." But Detective Harris didn't care. He grabbed her arm, gentle but firm, and clicked the handcuffs on her wrists. Click. Click. "Tell it to the judge," he said, leading her toward the car. That's when Tim spoke up. He'd been quiet, standing by the door with Mike the cop, watching it all. Now he stepped forward, his voice loud and clear. "I'm not just your neighbor, Karen," he said. Karen turned, her face pale. "What?" she squeaked. Tim's smile grew a big, proud smile. "I'm the investigator who's been tracking you for months," he said. "That fence? It was bait. I built it to get you mad, to make you slip up. And you fell for it?" Karen's knees wobbled. "Investigator," she whispered. "Bait." Her brain couldn't keep up. Tim nodded. "Yep," he said. "I've been living here, watching you, writing down everything. "You been taking HOA money for the park, the lights, the stuff we all need and keeping it for yourself. I've got proof. Pictures, notes, bank records. All of it." He tapped his pocket where his phone was. "Every time you came by, I added more." Mike the cop chimed in. "He's good at his job," he said, grinning at Tim. "Been helping us for a while." Detective Harris nodded. "We were already coming for you today, Karen," he said. Tim just made it easier. Karen's face went from red to white. She looked at the fence, then at Tim, then at the handcuffs on her wrists. "No," she shouted. "This isn't fair. That fence is still illegal." Tim laughed a real, happy laugh. "Doesn't matter now, does it?" he said. "You're the one in trouble." Detective Harris tugged her toward the car. "Let's go," he said. Karen pulled back, yelling. "I'm the HOA boss. You can't do this." But they could, and they did. She stumbled, her shoe slipping, as Harris opened the car door and guided her in. The door slammed shut bang, and her yells got muffled. Neighbors were watching now. Mrs. Lee peeked from her porch, her watering can forgotten. Mr. Brown stood by his gate, jaw dropped. Kids on bikes stopped, staring. "What's happening?" one whispered. "Karen's in trouble," another said. The police car with Mike stayed parked, lights still flashing, while Detective Harris's car started up. Vroom. Karen banged on the window inside, her red lipstick smeared, but no one helped her. The car pulled away, lights spinning, taking her down the street and out of sight. Tim turned to Mike. "Thanks for coming," he said. Mike tipped his hat. "Anytime, Tim. Good work." He got back in his car and drove off too, sirens quiet now. Tim stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at his fence. It was still there, 3 feet tall, sturdy and perfect. He smiled, a quiet smile this time, like he'd just finished a big puzzle. After that wild morning when the cops took Karen away, Meadow Lane wasn't the same. The sun kept shining, the birds kept chirping, and kids still rode their bikes up and down the street. But something big had changed. Karen Phelps, the bossy HOA lady who acted like she owned everything, was gone. And Tim Carter? He wasn't just the new guy anymore. Nope, he was a hero, and everyone was about to find out why. Let's start with what happened right after the police cars left. Karen was in the back of that dark car, banging on the window and yelling. "This is my HOA. You can't do this," she shouted, her voice all squeaky and mad. But the car kept going, vroom, down the street, around the corner, and out of sight. Her yells got quieter and quieter until they were gone. Neighbors stood there, jaws dropped, watching it all. Mrs. Lee held her watering can, frozen. Mr. Brown's dog sat by his feet, tilting its head. Kids on bikes whispered, "She's gone." It was like a storm had passed, and now the air felt lighter. Tim stayed by his house. He leaned against that fence, the one Karen hated so much, his hands in his pockets. That fence was 3 feet tall, made of strong wood, and it looked good in the sunlight. He gave a little wave as the police car drove off, a small smile on his face. He didn't cheer or jump around. He was calm, like always, but his eyes sparkled like he'd just won a big game. And he had, oh boy, he had. See, here's the truth that came out that day: Karen had been sneaky for years. She wasn't just bossy, she was a thief. The HOA collected money from everyone in Meadow Lane. It was cash for fun stuff, like fixing the playground with its squeaky swings or putting new bulbs in the streetlights so they'd glow at night. Every month, people gave a little bit of money to make the neighborhood nice. But Karen? She didn't use it for that. Nope, she took it, thousands of dollars, and hid it in a secret bank account just for herself. How did she do it? Well, she was sneaky. She'd write in her notebook that the playground got fixed, but it didn't. The swings still squeaked, and the slides still had rust. She'd say the streetlights were new, but they flickered and buzzed. Nobody checked too hard because Karen was loud and acted like she knew everything. She'd yell about rules like how tall a fence could be and everyone just listened. But while she bossed people around, she was stealing, tucking all that money away for fancy stuff like new shoes or big trips. She thought no one would catch her. Boy, was she wrong. Tim wasn't just some random guy who moved in. Nope, he was a pro and undercover investigator. That means he had a secret job to catch bad guys like Karen without them knowing. He didn't come to Meadow Lane by accident. Someone, maybe the police or the bank, found out Karen was taking money, but they needed proof. So they sent him. He moved in with his old truck and his boxes, acting like a regular guy, but he was really there to watch her. That fence? It wasn't just for privacy. It was a trick, a big, clever trick to get Karen to mess up. Karen fell for it hard. She got so mad about the fence 3 feet tall instead of 2 that she couldn't stop herself. She came by every day, taking pictures, leaving notes, yelling about rules. And every time she did, Tim wrote it down on his phone. Tap, 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 he kept track of everything. He took pictures too of her notes, her measuring tape, her sneaky moves. He even found papers she'd thrown away, showing where the money went. Little by little, he built a big pile of proof that said, Karen's a thief. And then, when she called 911, thinking she'd get Tim in trouble, it was the perfect moment. The cops were already coming for her, and Tim's plan worked like magic. Back to that morning after the cars drove off, the neighborhood buzzed. People stepped out of their houses, looking at Tim's place. Mrs. Lee walked over first. She's the nice old lady with gray hair and cookies. Tim, she said, her voice soft, you're an investigator. Tim nodded, leaning on his fence. Yep, he said. Been working on this for months. Her eyes got big. You caught Karen? She asked. Tim grinned. With a little help, he said, pointing at the fence. She couldn't resist. Mr. Brown came next, his little dog trotting behind. I knew something was up, he said, laughing. You were too calm, Tim. Too calm. Tim chuckled. Sometimes you gotta be quiet to catch the loud ones, he said. Mr. Brown slapped his knee. Ha! That's good, he said. Kids on bikes rolled up too, staring at Tim like he was a superhero. Did you really trick her? One asked. Yep, Tim said, winking. That fence was bait, and she bit it. The kids giggled, pedaling off to tell their friends. Word spread fast. By lunchtime, everyone in Meadow Lane knew. People stood in their yards, talking loud. Karen stole the money, one lady said, shocked. For years, a man answered. Tim got her, another yelled. It was like a party, but instead of cake, they were celebrating Karen being gone. The playground money, the streetlight money, it was all supposed to help them, and Karen took it. Now they had Tim to thank for fixing it. A few days later, something big happened. The next HOA meeting. Normally, these meetings were boring. Karen would stand up front, holding her notebook, telling everyone what to do. Cut your grass, she'd say. No tall fences, she'd snap. People went because they had to, but they didn't like it. This time, though, the meeting was different. It was in the park at the end of the street, under a big tree with picnic tables. The swings squeaked nearby, and the sun was setting, turning the sky pink. Everyone showed up: Mrs. Lee, Mr. Brown, the kids, even the dogs. They sat on benches or stood in little groups, whispering. Karen wasn't there, of course. She was in jail now, waiting for a judge to decide what to do with her. Instead, Tim walked up front. He didn't have a notebook or a bossy voice. He just stood there in his jeans and a t-shirt, hands in his pockets, smiling that easy smile. Hey, everyone, he said, loud so they could hear. Guess you know what happened. People nodded, some clapping a little. Karen's gone, he said. She was stealing from us, all of us. Money for the park, the lights, everything. I've been watching her since I moved in. That fence? It was to make her mad, to get her to show what she was really like. And it worked. He paused, letting it sink in. Mrs. Lee raised her hand. How much did she take? She asked. Tim scratched his head. Thousands, he said. Maybe $10,000 or more. People gasped. 10,000. Mr. Brown said. That's a lot. Tim nodded. Yep. She hid it in a secret account. But we found it, me and the police. It's coming back to the HOA now. A lady with a baby stood up. So the playground can get fixed, she asked. Tim smiled. Yep, he said. New swings, a better slide, whatever you want. The kids cheered, jumping up and down. New swings, they yelled. A man near the back shouted, "What about the lights?" Tim turned. "Those two," he said. "No more flickering. We'll make it right." People started clapping loud, happy claps that echoed through the park. Tim held up his hands. Wait, he said, laughing. "I'm not done. Karen's in big trouble. She's going to court soon. Stealing like that? She might be in jail for a long time." More cheers. "Good," someone yelled. "She deserves it," another said. Tim nodded. "The police have all my proof, pictures, notes, bank stuff. She can't wiggle out of this." Then Mr. Brown stepped up. He was grinning big. "Tim," he said, "you're a hero. Should have known you were too calm for a regular guy." Everyone laughed, even Tim. "Sometimes you gotta let the loud ones dig their own hole," he said, shrugging. Karen dug hers deep. People clapped again, some shaking his hand, some patting his back. "Thanks, Tim," they said. "You saved us." The meeting went on like that, everyone talking, planning, smiling. They picked a new HOA boss, Mrs. Lee, because she was nice and fair. "I won't steal," she promised, and everyone cheered. They talked about fixing the park first: new swings for the kids, a sandbox, maybe a bench for the grown ups. The money Karen took was coming back, bit by bit, and Meadow Lane was going to be better than ever. After the meeting, people stayed in the park. The sky got dark, stars popping out, and someone brought lemonade. Kids ran around, chasing fireflies, while grown ups sat and chatted. Tim leaned against the tree, sipping his drink, watching it all. He didn't say much, just listened as people thanked him again and again. "You're staying, right?" Mrs. Lee asked. Tim nodded. "Yep," he said. "I like it here." She smiled. "Good. We need you." Days turned into weeks, and Meadow Lane healed. The playground got new swings, no more squeaks. The street lights glowed bright, no flickering. Karen's house sat empty, her perfect flowers wilting without her. People said she was still in jail, waiting for her day in court. The police told Tim she'd probably stay there a long time. Stealing that much money was a big deal. "Justice served," Detective Harris said on the phone one day. Tim just grinned. "Yep," he said. "She earned it." Tim kept his fence. Nobody cared it was 3 feet tall anymore. It stood there, strong and proud, a reminder of how he'd tricked Karen. Neighbors stopped by sometimes, just to say hi. "That fence is famous now," Mr. Brown joked. Tim laughed. "Guess so," he said. He wasn't undercover anymore, he was just him, the guy who saved the neighborhood. Karen's yells faded from memory. "This is my HOA," she'd screamed, but no one listened then, and no one missed her now. She'd bossed everyone around, stolen their money, and thought she'd win. But Tim was smarter, quieter, and better. He let her dig her hole, and she fell right in. Meadow Lane was free, happy, and safe again thanks to him. Tim's life in Meadow Lane got even better after that big meeting. The neighborhood wasn't just free of Karen, it was buzzing with new energy. People smiled more, waved more, and stopped by each other's houses just to chat. The park became the best spot on the street. Those new swings. They were bright red, shiny, and didn't squeak at all. Kids swung high, their laughs filling the air. They'd shout, kicking their legs. The slide got fixed too, no more rust, just smooth metal that gleamed in the sun. Even the sandbox was new, full of soft yellow sand where kids built castles and dug tunnels. The street lights were a big deal too. Before, they'd flicker and buzz, making the street look spooky at night. Now, they shone bright and steady, lighting up every corner of Meadow Lane. People could walk their dogs after dark without tripping, and kids could play a little longer before bedtime. "Looks like a new place," Mr. Brown said one evening, his little dog wagging its tail under the glow. Tim nodded, sitting on his porch. "It's what the money was for," he said. "Karen had it all wrong." Speaking of Karen, she didn't come back. Her big white house stayed quiet, the windows dark. Her perfect flowers started drooping, petals falling onto the grass. Nobody watered them anymore, and nobody missed her. Word got around that she was still in jail, locked up in a gray building far away. Detective Harris called Tim one day with an update. "She's got a court date soon," he said. "With all that proof you gave us? She's not getting out easy." Tim leaned back in his rocking chair. "Good," he said. "She earned it? What did Karen do with all that money she stole?" People started piecing it together. Some said she bought fancy clothes, dresses and shiny shoes she never wore in Meadow Lane. Others heard she took big trips to places with beaches and palm trees. One neighbor, a lady with curly hair, swore she saw Karen at the mall once, carrying bags full of stuff. "She was spending our playground money," the lady huffed. Tim didn't care where it went, he cared that it was coming back. The bank found her secret account, and bit by bit, the HOA got the cash returned. It wasn't all at once, but it was enough to start fixing things. Tim's fence stayed up, of course. That 3-foot-tall wall of wood became a legend in Meadow Lane. Kids would ride by on their bikes, pointing at it. "That's the trick fence," they'd say, giggling. Grown UPS smiled when they passed it too. "Smart move, Tim," Mr. Brown said one day, tipping his hat. "Fooled her good." Tim just grinned. "Had to," he said. "She made it easy." The fence wasn't just a fence anymore, it was a story, a big win, a sign that Meadow Lane was smarter than Karen thought. Life went on, and Tim settled in for real. He wasn't undercover anymore, so he didn't have to hide. He mowed his lawn, painted his mailbox blue, and even got a little grill for his porch. On weekends, you'd smell burgers cooking, the smoky scent drifting down the street. Neighbors stopped by to say hi or bring him stuffed cookies from Mrs. Lee, a cold soda from Mr. Brown. "You're one of us now," Mrs. Lee said one day, handing him a plate of chocolate chip goodies. Tim took a bite. "Thanks," he said. "I like it here." The kids loved him too. They'd knock on his door sometimes, asking questions. "Are you a spy?" a boy with freckles asked once. Tim laughed. "Not a spy," he said. "Just a guy who catches bad people." The boy's eyes got big. "Cool," he said, running off to tell his friends. Another time, a girl with pigtails asked, "Did you trick Karen with magic?" Tim winked. "Nope, just a fence," he said. "And a phone." The kids thought he was the coolest guy ever, like a hero from a comic book. One sunny afternoon, the neighborhood threw a party. It wasn't planned, it just happened. Someone said, "Let's celebrate," and everyone agreed. They met in the park, under that big tree with the picnic tables. Mrs. Lee brought cookies, Mr. Brown brought lemonade, and a lady down the street hauled out a big speaker for music. Kids ran around, playing tag, while grown UPS set up chairs and blankets. Tim showed up with his grill, flipping burgers for everyone. "Smells good," a kid yelled, and Tim tossed him a bun. "Eat up," he said. The party was loud and happy. Music played fun songs with bouncy beats and people danced a little, even the shy ones. The swings were full, kids swinging high and jumping off. Someone brought a ball, and a game of catch started. Dogs barked, chasing each other, their tails wagging like crazy. The sun sank low, turning the sky orange, and the new street lights clicked on, bright and clear. It was the best day Meadow Lane had in a long time. At one point, people gathered around Tim. "Tell us about Karen," a man shouted, holding a cup of lemonade. Tim sat on a picnic table, burger in hand, and shrugged. "Not much to tell," he said. "She stole, I watched, the fence got her mad, and the cops got her." Everyone laughed. "Come on," Mrs. Lee said. "How'd you stay so calm?" Tim took a bite, chewed, and smiled. "Easy," he said. "Loud people like her? They trip over themselves. I just waited." "Did she really think she'd win?" a kid asked, sitting on the grass. Tim nodded. "Yep," he said. "She thought calling 911 would scare me. But I knew the cops were coming for her." "She didn't." The kid giggled. "That's funny," he said. "She was so mad." Mr. Brown chimed in. "I heard her yelling in that car," he said. "This is my HOA," she screamed. Sounded like a baby. Everyone laughed again, picturing Karen's red face and wild hair. The party kept going. Stars came out, twinkling above, and the music got softer. People sat in little groups, eating and talking. What happens to the HOA now? A lady asked. Mrs. Lee stood up. She was the new boss, after all. We'll use the money right, she said. No stealing, just fixing. Maybe a new bench here, some flowers there. People clapped. Can we paint the clubhouse? A kid yelled. The clubhouse was an old shed by the park, faded and peeling. Mrs. Lee smiled. Sure, she said. What color? Blue, one kid shouted. Green, another said. They all laughed, planning together. Tim listened, sipping his lemonade. He didn't say much, just watched everyone have fun. That's how he was, quiet but happy. He'd done his job, caught the bad guy, and now he could relax. Meadow Lane wasn't just a mission anymore, it was home. His little house with the red door, his famous fence, his new friends, it all felt right. Weeks passed, and things stayed good. The playground got a new bench, painted bright yellow by the kids. The clubhouse got a fresh coat of green paint, with flowers planted around it. The street lights glowed every night, and people started leaving their porch lights on too, making the whole street warm and cozy. Karen's house got sold to a nice family with a baby and a puppy. They didn't care about rules, just waved and smiled like Tim did. One evening, Tim sat on his porch, rocking in his chair. The air was cool, crickets chirped, and the sky was full of stars. Mrs. Lee walked by, her dog on a leash. Hey, Tim, she said, stopping. You did a great thing. Tim rocked back. Thanks, he said. Wasn't just me, the fence helped. She laughed. That fence is a star, she said. Karen never saw it coming. Tim grinned. Nope, he said. Sometimes you let the loud ones dig their own hole. Mrs. Lee nodded. She dug deep, she said. And fell right in. They both smiled, looking at the fence in the moonlight. It stood there, quiet and strong, a reminder of how Tim turned everything around. Karen thought she ruled Meadow Lane, but she was wrong. Tim did, with a little wood, a phone, and a lot of smarts. Meadow Lane was peaceful now. No more bossy notes, no more stolen money, just friends, fun, and a fixed-up park. Karen's yells were a memory, fading like old paint. This is my HOA, she'd screamed, but it wasn't hers anymore. It was everyone's, and Tim made sure of that. Justice was served, loud and clear, and Meadow Lane was better than ever. So, there you have it, friends, the wild tale of Karen, Tim, and that tricky fence in Meadow Lane. It's all over now, and wow, what a ride. A nosy HOA lady who thought she ruled the world, a sneaky fence that wasn't just a fence, and a twist so big it flipped everything upside down. Makes you think, doesn't it? Let's sit back, take a deep breath, and talk about what the story means, because it's not just about Karen and Tim. It's about you, me, and everyone we meet. First, picture Meadow Lane one more time. It's a sunny little street with cute houses, green grass, and kids riding bikes. The birds are singing, the dogs are barking, and everything feels happy again. Karen's gone off in a police car, yelling her head off, and Tim's still there, leaning on his famous 3-foot fence. The swings in the park don't squeak anymore, the street lights glow bright, and people wave at each other like old friends. It's peaceful now, all because one quiet guy outsmarted one loud lady. Pretty cool, huh? Let's think about Karen for a minute. She was loud, super loud. She strutted around with her notebook, her red lipstick, and her sharp eyes, telling everyone what to do. Cut your grass, she'd yell. No tall fences, she'd snap. She acted like she owned every blade of grass, every mailbox, every inch of Meadow Lane. And when Tim showed up with his fence, she got madder than a wet cat. She took pictures, left notes, even called 911, thinking she'd win. She shouted so much, you could hear her from the park. But here's the funny thing, all that noise. It was hiding something. Karen wasn't just bossy, she was sneaky. She stole money, lots of it, from the HOA. Money for swings, lights, and fun stuff got tucked away in her secret bank account. She thought nobody would notice. She thought being loud and pushy would keep her safe. But loud doesn't mean right, does it? Sometimes, the people who yell the most, who act like they're the boss, are hiding the biggest secrets. Karen shouted and pointed fingers, but she was the one doing wrong. Makes you wonder who else out there is loud to cover up something sneaky? Now, let's talk about Tim. He was the opposite of Karen. Quiet, calm, chill like a breeze on a hot day. He moved into Meadow Lane with his old truck and his big smile, waving at everyone. When Karen got mad about his fence, he didn't yell back. He didn't rip down her notes or stomp around. He just smiled, waved, and said, "Good morning." Most people would have gotten mad, maybe shouted, "Leave me alone." Not Tim. He stayed cool, even when Karen stuck notes on his door that said, "Take it down or else." Weird, right? But that's what made him special. Tim wasn't just calm for fun, he had a plan. He was an investigator, a secret hero watching Karen the whole time. That fence? It wasn't just wood and nails. It was bait like a worm on a hook to catch a fish. He built it 3 feet tall, knowing it'd make Karen flip out. And she did. She got so mad, she couldn't stop herself. She kept coming by, snapping pictures, calling the cops. Every time she did, Tim wrote it down on his phone. Tap, 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 building proof she was a thief. He stayed quiet, let her dig her own hole, and then bam, she fell right in. Quiet Tim won, and loud Karen lost. So, what's the big lesson here? Think about this: the loudest person in the room isn't always the strongest. Karen shouted and bossed, but she was weak inside, stealing and hiding. Tim was quiet, but he was strong, smart, sneaky in a good way, and brave. Sometimes, the people who don't talk much, who don't brag or push, are the ones with the real power. They watch, they think, they wait, and when the time's right, they surprise everyone. Isn't that wild? Let's imagine you're in Meadow Lane. Maybe you're riding a bike past Tim's house, looking at that fence. It's still there, tall and proud, a reminder of what happened. You might think, wow, that guy's cool. And he is. But you know what? You could be like Tim too. You don't have to be loud to be awesome. You don't have to yell or boss people around to win. Sometimes, being quiet, being smart, being kind, that's what makes you strong. Karen thought noise was power, but Tim showed it's not. Real power is inside, waiting for the right moment. Here's something else to chew on: people aren't always what they seem. Karen looked like the big boss head of the HOA, perfect house, fancy flowers. Everyone listened to her because she acted so sure. But she was a thief, hiding behind her rules. Tim looked like a regular guy: messy hair, old jeans, beat-up truck. Nobody thought he was special, but he was a hero. You can't tell who someone is just by looking, can you? The loud ones might be faking, and the quiet ones might be amazing. Next time you meet someone, maybe think twice before you decide who they are. What about you? Have you ever met a Karen, someone loud and bossy who thinks they're in charge? Maybe at school, in your class, there's a kid who yells a lot, telling everyone what to do. Or maybe a grown-up, a teacher, a neighbor who acts big but isn't so great underneath. And what about a Tim? Someone quiet, maybe shy, who surprises you with how cool they are. I bet you've seen both. This story says, watch out for the loud ones, they might be hiding something. And cheer for the quiet ones, they might change everything. Let's take it bigger. Imagine your street, your school, your town. There's always someone like Karen, right? Someone who talks loud, points fingers, makes rules. And there's always a Tim, someone who doesn't brag but does the right thing. This story's not just about Meadow Lane, it's about everywhere. It's about how sneaky tricks and loud voices don't win forever. It's about how being smart and good can beat being noisy and mean. That's a pretty happy thought, isn't it? Back to that fence for a sec. It's still standing in Tim's yard, 3 feet tall, a little weathered now but strong. Kids ride by and point. That's the Karen fence, they say, laughing. Grown UPS smile when they see it too. It's famous in Meadow Lane, a symbol of how one guy turned things around. Next time you see a fence or anything someone's building, maybe give a wave instead of a glare. You never know who's behind it. They might be a regular person, or they might be a Tim, waiting to surprise the world. Think about your own life. Are you loud like Karen sometimes? Do you shout to get your way? Or are you quiet like Tim, watching, thinking, planning? Maybe you're a little of both, and that's okay. This story says you don't have to be loud to matter. You can be yourself, quiet, loud, or in between, and still do big things. Tim didn't need to yell to win. He used his brain, his patience, and a little wood. What could you do with what you've got? Let's picture one last scene. It's evening in Meadow Lane. The sun's gone down, the sky's dark, and stars are twinkling. Tim's on his porch, rocking in his chair, sipping a soda. The street lights glow, the park's quiet, and a soft breeze rustles the trees. Mrs. Lee walks by with her dog. "Hey, Tim," she says. "You changed this place." Tim smiles. "We all did," he says. "Karen just helped by being loud." They laugh, and the night feels warm and safe. That's the end, friends. A story of a loud lady who fell, a quiet guy who rose, and a neighborhood that got better. It makes you think, the ones who shout the loudest might be hiding the most. And the quiet ones, they could be the ones who change the game. So, next time you see someone building a fence or doing anything, don't judge too fast. Give 'em a wave, a smile, a chance. You never know who they really are, or what awesome thing they might do. What did you think of that twist with Tim and Karen? Did it surprise you? Make you laugh? Drop it in the comments. I want to hear everything. And tell me, who's the Tim in your life? Who's the Karen? Let's chat about it. Thanks for sticking with me through this wild ride. See you in the next story. Stay curious, stay kind, and keep watching for the quiet heroes. They're out there, and they're awesome. The street got quiet again. Birds chirped. A dog barked. Kids started pedaling their bikes, whispering about what they'd seen. Mrs. Lee walked over, slow and careful. "Tim," she said, "you're an investigator." Tim nodded. "Yep," he said. "Undercover. Had to catch her." Mrs. Lee's eyes got big. "Wow," she said. "That's amazing." Tim shrugged. "Just doing my job," he said, but his grin said he was proud. Karen was gone. Tim's secret was out. That fence. It wasn't just a fence, it was a trap, a sneaky trick to get Karen to show who she really was. And it worked. She'd called 911, thinking she'd win, but the cops were already coming for her. Tim had played it smart, quiet, and cool, and now Meadow Lane knew the truth. What a morning.